Hello everyone, so this is going to be the Turning Red lecture. So Turning Red is one of the options for Essay 2, and of course the objective of Essay 2 is to determine the message of Turning Red and argue how it sends its message in order to conduct a rhetorical analysis of the film. So, with this lecture, the whole idea is to give you ideas of what you could write about in terms of how the movie sends its message and what the movie's message is. So we'll start out with a little intro on Turning Red. This is the 25th Pixar film, and it was directed by Domee Shi, Pixar's second female director and the first to direct a feature on her own. So that is pretty significant and a good milestone for Pixar. This is her follow-up to her short film Bao, which I have on the slide here, which is about the relationship between a mother and son. So in that short film, this mother creates a child out of a dumpling, and she doesn't want to let him go, and she ends up eating the dumpling to keep him safe, quote unquote, forever. So it's very similar in theme to Turning Red, which is also about the relationship between parents and children, and parents' tendency to shelter children and how that can be detrimental to them. So we're going to be talking about all of that throughout the course of this lecture. So yeah, it came after Bao, also directed by Domee Shi, and it was released straight to Disney+. It was sort of the last straight to Disney Plus release for Pixar, which was done in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And when it came out, this came out in March of this year. It was controversial, somewhat, because of its content. And by that, I mean it includes pretty open discussion of puberty. It mentions menstruation, at least indirectly. And it also has words like sexy, crap, stripper music, etc., which sort of caused a bit of a stir among parents who, might have Disney Plus in their households, and their child might, flip to Turning Red one day. And yeah, parents did not approve, or at least some parents did not approve, and they also believed that the film was about how it's okay to disobey your parents. But is that really the case? So let's explore this film and what it's trying to communicate and what its message is. So in order to understand its message, we're going to need some context. So this was produced during the COVID-19 pandemic, like I said. And of course, parents were having to take care of their children and watch their children even more closely than they had in the past, because schools were closed, and of course parents had to spend more time with their children. So I think that really does sort of inform the message that this film is going for. Some other important context is that this was released amid Disney's feud with Governor Ron DeSantis over Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. So basically, to give you a brief rundown of this event, Florida passed this bill that prohibited certain grade levels in school from discussing sexual orientation. So advocates of the bill said children were too young to discuss such things, whereas proponents argued that, or not proponents, but opponents of the bill argued that it was discriminatory towards children who might identify as queer, and they thought it was erasing queer people, and they did not approve. And they said it wasn't inappropriate at all because, of course, talking about sexual orientation doesn't necessarily mean talking about sex. So, that was a whole big fight, and DeSantis threatened to, this is Chapek, CEO of Disney, DeSantis threatened to take away the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is basically Disney's own government in Orlando, so they can run Disney World on their own terms. I think that the district is in danger, but could be saved because I think Disney's going to take legal action. But the bill did pass in the end, but it was a whole big fight. And that also reflects sort of the theme of the movie about what children should be exposed to or hidden from. And I think the fact that this movie is quote-unquote inappropriate, at least in the eyes of some, is relevant to that as well. It's very meta in a way. I think it's very self-aware. It knows that it's not your typical kids movie, and it runs with it to send its message that kids, in the film's opinion, should not be sheltered, and that certain things that adults might think are quote-unquote inappropriate are actually important topics to talk about. And of course, that makes sense as a message considering more historical context of children nowadays with streaming services and smartphones everywhere. They see more of the world than they've ever seen before. And there's a question inherent to that reality of how do we control what they see? And along those lines, I want to talk about now the film's genre, which I think is very significant to its message. So the genre of Turning Red is, fantasy, family, but it's also Disney. And Disney itself, we could say, is a genre. The Disney genre is often typified by magic and innocence. So we do have magic in this movie, and it's a culturally grounded magic at that, with Sun Yi imparting panda powers to her, to the women of her family, and the gods. I honestly did not know that the Chinese people had gods until I watched this movie. That's how ignorant I was of their culture. The gods granted her panda powers. So we got magic, mysticism, etc. But we don't really have much innocence. That said, Disney isn't necessarily as innocent as we might think. So to kick off that discussion, I want to talk about, first of all, this example of this man wanted his son who passed away, sadly, to have Spider-Man on his grave. And of course Disney, because the son loved Spider-Man, but Disney, of course, didn't approve because Spider-Man is their property now, and they say having him on a gravestone removes the innocence and magic of their brand. Which, I thought, I'm a Disney fan, but they can pull some pretty shitty moves, in my opinion, sometimes. I thought that was a little insensitive, and I also thought it doesn't make much sense considering the fact that Spider-Man deals with death himself in his story with the death of his uncle, correct? So that is what I call, and I think I might be the first person to call it this, the Disney paradox. Because even though Disney likes to pride itself on being innocent, there are several things underneath that facade of innocence in Disney movies that might be considered not too innocent or inappropriate, quote unquote, or just a fact of life. Even in... Well, let's think about that with other examples of Disney movies. Alright, so let's throw it back to 1940, because Disney just remade Pinocchio. But we can see not so innocent things in Pinocchio with smoking and drinking. And of course, that is significant to what the film is trying to say. And it's saying that smoking and drinking are bad and Pinocchio shouldn't be doing this. I don't know if anyone has seen the new film, but in the new remake, they cut out the drinking and they cut out the smoking, and they replaced the beer with root beer. So they sort of chicken out and don't want kids seeing kids drinking and smoking, even if it's meant to show that it's bad. But there are non-innocent things in Disney films, even though they like to present themselves as so innocent. But you might be thinking, well, Professor Fuller, this was 1940, and we're much more sensitive nowadays. Although, let's look at a more recent example. Let's flash forward to the 90s. Okay, R.I.P. Mufasa, too soon. But, we do see death on screen in Disney, in 1994. And of course, they don't get rid of this in the remake. So death is a part of Disney movies quite often. So they don't shy away from things like that. Even though, you know, children, it might be said, they don't need to think about death at such a young age. But then, so we got death, we got smoking and drinking, and some things in Disney are just plain scary, right? Like Chernabog on Night on Bald Mountain. And of course, Pinocchio, the donkey transformation scene. That's terrifying. And Snow White running through woods that are scary. That's terrifying. So it's not as if Disney doesn't have scary moments. It's not as if Disney is just for babies. Disney does have rather intense moments that seem quote-unquote adult, even though they like to present themselves as this innocent company. But you may be asking yourself, what about sex? Because that will lead us into Turning Red. Disney, do they ever discuss sex? I can think of a few examples. But sex has always been a big no-no. You can have drinking, you can have smoking, you can have people dying. You can have scary, terrifying scenes, but don't mention sex, whatever you do. Which is a bit ironic, because of course Disney is built also on romance, at least a lot of the time, with their princes and princesses. But I would argue that it does actually come up sometimes in Disney films. I will admit that sex is few and far between in Disney, but we do have things like The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The villain is obsessed with Esmeralda, and it's clearly not love, it's clearly a lustful obsession. And they even go as far as to have a whole song about it, and we have imagery like this, with Esmeralda, a vision of her dancing in a fireplace as a sort of vision or nightmare. So Disney does, on occasion, sort of broach the topic of sex, and this is in 96. It's almost Halloween at the recording of this video, and another example would be naturally Hocus Pocus, because a virgin lighting a candle is what brings the Sanderson sisters back. But of course, talking about virgins means implicitly you're talking about sex. So that is interesting, and they even sort of lampshade this in the sequel. So that's fun. But yeah. So, yes, we can see that Disney movies often aren't as quote unquote innocent as people might expect. And that's what I call the Disney paradox. And I think Turning Red is aware of its genre and knows that it isn't quote unquote innocent and uses that to help its message. So let's keep going. We have some symbols in Turning Red that I believe are important to its message. And of course, you will be tasked with analyzing at least one symbol in the paper. The symbol doesn't have to be any of these. It can be anything you see, just so long as it's something on screen that is not a character. A few symbols I noticed were Wilfred, her May's stuffed animal. And I think he represents, most of all, her childhood innocence, right? Her life before she starts growing up, which is where we meet her at the start of the film, when she's all happy to be 13 and an adult, at least according to her bus pass. So Wilfred indicates her childhood and who she was before, and who she still clings to. And I think she because she literally holds him, right? And I think she clings to Wilfred still because her mom wants to keep her as her little May May and shelter her. I wanted to bring in this clip where we see the picture almost drop, and she's holding Wilfred in the picture as a little girl. And Ming instantly puts it back up because she wants to keep May May, her little May May, right? Even as she's going through these changes. Alright. Our next symbol will be the drawing of Devon as a mermaid. So something interesting is mermaids are half human, half animal, sort of like how May becomes a half-human, half-animal hybrid in a way. And of course, May becoming a panda is a pretty on-the-nose metaphor for her hitting puberty. And with Devon being a mermaid, that sort of reflects that. Of course, being infatuated with boys is a sign of going through puberty for May. And the drawing of Devon itself is a depiction of puberty, of going through a change, right? Of seeming like you're an animal, right? You're like we see in the metaphor of May turning into a panda. The other symbol is the talisman that Ming wears around her neck. So this talisman contains her panda, which is giant and fearsome, and Ming wants to control her panda, obviously, because she thinks releasing the beast inside is a bad thing, and she learns from her daughter that that's not necessarily true. And her panda, I think, also represents her repressed feelings. The fact that she could squeeze so much of her trauma, represented by that huge panda, into one little talisman, that shows just how repressed she is. And of course, she has to let it out at some point, because she does have a lot of trauma. She feels like she let down her own mother, and she passes down that intergenerational trauma to May by trying to make her into the, quote, perfect daughter, even though perfection is, of course, impossible to achieve. So I think the fact that such a gigantic panda is contained in such a small item means to show just how repressed Ming is and how she needs to cope with her trauma. The final symbol, and probably the most important symbol, is the flower. So I want to bring back that clip I pulled up a second ago. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a flower in Little May's hair here. There's flowers right here. Her bedroom has flowers on the wallpaper. And honestly, the whole house seems to be covered in flowers. Well, they have flowers right here blossoming. They have flowers. They have a flower in the kitchen area. They even have pictures of flowers on their walls. They have flowers on the couch. And when May is hiding in the shower in an earlier scene, oh, well, first of all, let's not forget that in her dream, we have flowers with the faces of the boy band. And of course, when she has flowers on her apron, and when she thinks that May is having her first period, she sort of fumbles with this vase full of flowers. And there's flowers on the shower curtain. There's a hell of a lot of flowers in this house. And she even says, May, you are becoming a delicate, strong flower. And so I think the flower is supposed to represent what her mom wants her to be. It's like this whole house is a garden full of flowers, and May is just another flower to be pruned and fussed over, right? But she needs to grow freely, right? She doesn't need to be a flower in her mother's garden. She needs to be her own person. And you'll notice in the climax, or just before the climax, when she's about to go through with the ritual, she is wearing a flower in her beret, but we see her wearing that same beret at the end of the movie, and there is no flower in it. So she's not being pruned, quote unquote, by her mother anymore. She is her own person doing her own thing, while still respecting her mother, because she says to her mom, I'll be back by 4, or I'll be back before dinner. So yeah, I think the flower is a pretty clear symbol, and I think it's the most important one because it pops up literally everywhere. Alright, so let's move forward with our conversation. Like I said before, May's transformation into a panda is a pretty straightforward metaphor for puberty and going through bodily changes. And of course, I think the movie really wants to make that metaphor explicit and clear by showing Ming mistakenly believing that May has gotten her first period, right? So it knows that it's a Disney movie, but it's saying, hey, Disney movies aren't what you think they are. And it presents this conversation between this mother and daughter about having her first period. They put that in a Disney movie. And you would think it shouldn't belong there, but, you know, it seems not as quote-unquote inappropriate as you might think. So I think the film really wants to encourage parents and children to talk about things like this, right? Because they're important conversations to have. It really is all for a communication between parents and children instead of sheltering them. And of course, we also have not even just the metaphor for starting one's period. We also have the fact that May says, I like boys, I like gyrating, and she even says, we will become women when we go see Four Town. Which, what could that mean other than it will be their sexual awakening? And she also has a son, quote unquote, with one of the Four Town members, like her little Tamagotchi. So there are definitely light sexual references. And I think the reason they're placed there is because the film wants people to reconsider, you know, what a Disney film is, and therefore reconsider what is appropriate to talk with your children about. because it is important to have these sorts of conversations with your children about sexuality, about growing up, etc., etc. I also found it interesting that the film uses a lot of culture, which is common for Disney films nowadays, which are trying to represent diverse cultures. We just had Encanto, for example, which really tries to accurately represent Colombian culture, etc., etc. So I thought that was par for the course of what Disney is trying to do nowadays by representing these cultures as accurately as they can. By way of that, they also introduce a sort of feminist theme, because May says, we honor our ancestors, but not just the dudes, right? So sort of taking a shot at patriarchal societies. And it also is telling that Sun Yi receives her panda powers from the gods, and the reason she asked for them is so she can be independent, because previously she depended on the men of her village to take care of her, but they all went off to war. But now she can take care of herself. Something else is the one who does the cooking in the family is the father, which is not very traditional in terms of gender roles. So it's sort of saying these gender roles are outdated or meaningless, etc., and that anyone can take on any role in a family, and people should be their own person, women should be independent, etc. And I think that really comes out at the end when she declares, my panda, my choice, because she's certainly empowered as a young woman, isn't she? So I can really see a feminist message here as well. The film also is speaking against helicopter parenting, but Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians, in this case, would also call this tiger parenting, or the tiger mom, if you will, is a typical way for Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians to express how their mom treated them during their childhood, or their dad. With having high expectations, you always have to make the best grades, etc., etc. You always have to put the family first. That is the typical experience of a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of Asian Canadians. So, and you probably, that's probably already well known that kids of Asian descent are expected to perform better academically and so on in their households. So we see that here, and the film really speaks out against it, because the film shows that the reason that Ming treats May this way is because she feels she failed as a daughter, and that's why she treats May that way, which is not good, and that prevents May from being her own person, and it puts a lot of pressure on May, even though she's not perfect, which is totally valid because no one is perfect. Ming expects her to be perfect, which is not good. So the film really speaks out against that and speaks for dealing with the trauma that causes Ming to behave the way she does towards her daughter. Something else that I wanted to talk about is the fact that the film seems to be a commentary on internet culture, kind of. It is set in 2002, probably because the director herself was 13 years old in 2002. But honestly, it feels like it could take place in 2022, because we have the kids all have cell phones at school, which I don't know if that was super common back in 2002, but I'm going to say, generally speaking, probably not, for every child to have a cell phone. And of course, through their cell phones, they learn about a cool panda that they need to go see. Almost kind of like in a social media type way, they learn about the panda. May and her friends even seem to become influencers in a way, which could be, they even have merch, which could be a comment upon social media, especially what kids see on social media, because of course that is a concern nowadays, and that really ties into the whole movie's theme of children being sheltered and how that's not a good thing. And it's sort of meta commentary too. These kids in the movie go to see the panda without their parents' knowledge. In the same way, a child could watch Turning Red without their parents' knowledge. So it is sort of another example of the film being self-aware and saying that parents should not hide their children away from having frank discussions about puberty, about sexuality, etc., etc. I wanted to talk about Four Town specifically because I think it also, I think they tie the whole film together. Four Town is important to May's growth in more than one way. I mentioned how it's her sexual awakening, but I think it's also her self-discovery. It's how she becomes her own person as well. Because it's Four Town and there are four friends in the movie: May, Miriam, Abby, and Priya. But there's 5 members despite the name, which Ming even points out. And of course, by the end of the movie, there are 4 friends. Not 4 friends anymore, but 5 friends by the end of the movie because they add Tyler to the group. So May really grows as a person. And going out with her friends shows that growth as a person and having her own life apart from her mother. Let's not forget also that the music of Four Town is what helps Ming transform back into her usual self. It helps contain Ming's panda. So that just shows that the boy band brings mother and daughter together. And it turns out that they're not so different, right? Because Ming, after she goes into the liminal bamboo space, she sees her mother as a kid, and Four Town gets her there. So Four Town really brings mom and daughter together. They represent not only May becoming her own person separate from her mom, but also May reconciling with her mom. So I think Four Town is very important in the movie. And I just wanted to have a slide to highlight their function in the film and how they help the film achieve its message. So, what is the message, speaking of that? I think the most obvious message is that children should not be sheltered and should be allowed to be their own person without the pressure of unrealistic expectations. So that pretty much sums it up. And of course the movie achieves that through its plot of May learning to become her own person, and also through symbolism and its meta commentary. It knows it's a Disney movie, and it's talking about puberty, it's talking about sex to some degree, etc. And it's saying that these things aren't necessarily inappropriate to talk about with your kids. They're actually very important to talk about with your kids. Because your kids aren't going to be your kids forever, right? I am not your little May May anymore, as May says in the climax of the movie to her mother. So, yeah, I think that's definitely what it's going for. And I also can see the female empowerment given Sun Yi and My Panda, My Choice, and all those things also inherent in the message. So, yes, I hope I gave you some things to think about with Turning Red, and I hope you can use this as a springboard for when you're writing about it. So remember, all you have to do is determine the message of the movie and then argue how the movie sends its message. And you need to do so using at least one symbol and analyzing at least one symbol. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time, and good luck with Essay 2. Goodbye guys.